My name is Kelly Greenlee. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian here at Prince Memorial Library. Some of my favorite programs and learning events are those that we do in partnership, and this is one of them. So this is Lawns Gone Wild. It's the very first event of what we hope will be a very long series, at least a year long, and it will be educating people about how they can undertake some sustainable practices in their own backyards. So approachable backyard sustainability. So we all need that. So thanks for coming. I have left on the back, there's a short bookmark type, piece of paper that has the schedule that's coming up for Lawns Gone Wild. We have all sorts of things that are coming up, and we're going to be tackling grassland management. We're going to be tackling, help me out here, Aaron. What are you doing? You're doing low input landscaping. Thank you. That's what I was trying to think of. Low input landscaping. We're going to be doing some seed saving later on in the year. We're going to be doing pollinator gardening, all sorts of things. So it's really very exciting. It's our pleasure to partner with the Chebeague and Cumberland Land Trust and with the Town of Cumberland Sustainability Committee. So I will introduce Penny Ashman from CCLT.
Hi, Penny. Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks.
So I'm Penny Ashman. I'm Executive Director of the Chebeague and Cumberland Land Trust. And I just want to thank you all for coming today. We're so excited to see a big crowd because we had a lot of fun partnering and brainstorming about what we could teach all of you about sustainable gardening for sustainable habitats, but also what we can do in our own backyards. So the Land Trust works on protecting large blocks of habitats. We've protected over 1,100 acres in the town of Cumberland and Chebeague, a lot of forests and fields and streams and ponds and shoreline. And so we work on a little bit of a larger scale, but it's really important. And we work also on connecting. One of our strategic priorities is connecting some of these large blocks that we've protected. And but it's also really important for everybody, you know, not everybody has 10 plus acres or more to conserve. So it's really important that we focus also on what's happening in our own backyard, because everything can add up. And if we're all doing some sustainable practices, we're hoping that it can make a difference in our community. So thank you so much for coming. We look forward to being inside for the first couple of sessions, but outside also later in the year. So we can see, you know, what's happening on the ground and outside. So we hope that you'll join us for the whole series. And now one of my partners, Jessie Lamar Vincent, is from the Sustainability Committee with the town. And they were successful in getting a grant to help pay for all this. So thank you so much, Jessie.
Hey, Jessie Lamar Vincent. I'm with the Town Sustainability Committee, part of the Lands and Conservation Commission. And part of the work we're doing, we got a grant to do some community resiliency on sort of resilient, sustainable landscaping topics. And so this series is part of that. And we have money to do this series again next year. So Aaron Parker is here to talk with you about gardening for habitat. He's doing a number of talks this year for us, and hopefully next year we'll be doing a bunch more hands-on talks for one of our projects that we're attempting to get a community town demonstration orchard going, so that we could have these sort of classes outside actually working with real plants and show you hands-on skills. So look forward to some of that maybe later this fall and then next year. And I'll give it away to Aaron from Edgewood Nursery to blow your minds about gardening stuff.
Let's not get our expectations too high. So before I start, there is a handout that goes along with this, and you can find it at this address. If you're particularly savvy with tech, you can use this QR code to get it. If you're particularly not savvy, you know, it'd be very helpful to have a paper handout. I think we have some of those and can probably run off some additional copies if needed, and you could talk to Kelly about that. And just a little bit about me. My name is Aaron Parker. I live about 10 minutes away in Falmouth. I was a landscaper for about 20 years and started growing some nursery stock to support my landscaping business, and decided that I liked doing that better. So I started this business, Edgewood Nursery, which is off Blackstrap Road in Falmouth, where I focus on unusual edibles, mostly perennial plants and minor fruit crops, as well as local ecotype native plants, which I'll talk more about in this presentation. Yeah, so let's get right into it. Oh, one more thing, I don't have a mic today, other than this one that I'm using for recording. So if you can't hear me in the back, please wave your hands and I'll try and talk louder. But at this volume, can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. All right. So also worth noting, this is the first time I've given this talk. I finished my slideshow and proofread my handout once yesterday at 5:30 p.m. So I don't, the pacing might be a little bit off, but I think we've got a 2-hour time slot thereabouts. Hour and a half. So we'll aim for an hour and a half, and it might be, might run over a tiny bit.
Jessica, could I just ask you, it might be difficult to hear you in the back, so if you could project a little louder, that'd be great.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, so might run over a tiny bit, but if you need to do other things or move on with your day or whatever, feel free to step out before the last little bits are in. All right, so we're going to start off with a little bit of ecological context about this place where we live. And so we live about here, and this line right here represents what was covered in ice about 20,000 years ago. So about 20,000 years ago, this spot right here was underneath about a mile of ice. Not much living here at that point, right? And that's not that long ago in geologic time. That's just like, the blink of an eye. So we live in a spot that was pretty recently glaciated. And that's going to have a pretty significant effect on the habitat that we live in now, and lots of stuff about how we relate to that habitat. So that's back here 20,000 years ago, and that's kind of peak glacier. Then the glaciers slowly recede. About 14,000 years ago, the glaciers had receded to where the coast currently is now. And very shortly after that, potentially even before that, first humans arrived in what we now call Maine. So likely the best science nowadays is saying that the ancestors of the Wabanaki people that still live here in Maine first settled in what is now the Gulf of Maine, because there was so much water tied up in those glaciers that what is now the Gulf was, dry land, and then they kind of followed the glaciers inward. And if you imagine what's left after a glacier recedes, it's a barren tundra landscape that slowly turned into forest. And about 10,000 years ago, the last glaciers in what we call Maine melted and aren't likely to come back anytime soon. This right here, this line, that represents the development and establishment of indigenous land management. A really important part when we're thinking about native plants and the ecology of Maine is that the entire, what we know as the native ecology of Maine, developed underneath this system of indigenous land management. So humans have always been a part of the ecology of Maine in the past, 20,000 years. So there's an old school of conservation and ecology that is sort of this hands-off idea. Like, in order to have a good ecology and good habitat, we just need to leave stuff alone. And that's not relevant in most places in the world, and certainly not Maine. Humans have to be involved in our ecology to have a healthy ecology. Not to mention, there's lots of humans here. We are going to be de facto involved in the ecology. So we should try and do that in a thoughtful and positive way rather than a bad way, which unfortunately has been the case a lot of the time recently. So there's not a lot that I can tell you about this large period of time, other than when humans first arrived here, they were not managing the landscape on a great, to a great degree. And by the time, we get up into this range, basically all the land in what is now Maine was fairly heavily managed. And that could, that exists on a range from like gardening annuals to, excuse me, to woodland management, to something, horticultural systems that are somewhere in between. And then this little block right here represents European colonization. So that's about, past 500 years, as opposed to the past 10 to 14,000 years of indigenous occupation of this land. When we think about what that pre-colonization landscape looked like, there's not great information, but it certainly was not the woodlands that we know from today. So I'm just going to read a little passage from a firsthand account of the Weymouth voyage to the Camden Hills in 1605. Passed over very good ground, pleasant and fertile, fit for pasture, for the space of some 3 miles, having but little wood. And that's a really important passage there, having but little wood. So we're talking about widely spaced, very large trees. That oak-like stands left in our pastures in England. So these trees are, surrounded by open space, very large, and that's a situation that is a result of human management. Good and great, fit timber for any use. Some small birch, hazel, and brake. Upon the hills grow notable high timber trees, masts for ships of 400 ton. And that's what a lot of the first colonists were especially interested in, was this, huge straight timber trees for shipbuilding. All right, first documented European contact is about 500 years ago. There was possible European contact before that, but there's so little evidence that we're not even going to touch on it. European colonization begins about 400 years ago, which led to epidemic diseases and genocide that removed a large portion of the indigenous people and greatly disrupted traditional land management. So because so many people were lost, there was not a population able to manage the broader landscape in the traditional manner. Plus that was being disrupted by colonization. So we start to see the forests getting denser and on such a great wide scale that it potentially caused a dramatic human-caused climate change in the opposite direction of what we see nowadays. So there's an event called the Little Ice Age that was potentially caused by the indigenous people of North America dying of epidemic diseases and massive forest undergrowth that sucked a bunch of carbon out of the atmosphere and caused a cold spell. Through this period, colonists logged out a lot of the forests. Maine is very unusual for the United States that large portions of the state never completely lost their forest cover. This area largely did. But the Great North Woods has been forest for thousands and thousands of years and remains forest, but of a very different character. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So around here, we got forests largely removed. And then as farming largely left southern Maine, we get forest regrowth. So you'll notice we're surrounded by forests. Maine has more forest cover than any other state. I think it's over 90% now. And that's great But those forests are not what we heard described in that account from the 1600s, where it's sort of widely spaced trees with like amazing pasture and all this. Our forests are very young and very dense, and dense to the point where light frequently does not hit the forest floor. So we're losing a lot of habitat for forest understory plants, and there's very little habitat for sun-loving native plants. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then most recently, at least in southern Maine, we've got suburbanization. So we've gone from, traditional land management to timber harvest, to farming, to forest regrowing, as a lot of the farming got shifted to the Midwest. And now we've got suburbanization, which unfortunately does not create great habitat. One other event here, we've got in the past couple hundred years, a lot of invasive plants have been introduced, mostly as part of the horticulture trade. Because people love interesting, pretty plants. I do myself. And unfortunately, that's brought us some plants that really are great at taking up space and that tend to degrade habitat. And kind of dark, but this is Blue Hill in 1802. And this is one of the earliest landscape paintings of Maine, and you can see it's like all wide open. And it's just an example of kind of when the forests of Maine were at their low ebb. Like I said, Maine was never totally deforested, but right next door in New Hampshire was 92% clear cut in this period, and is now back up to something like 80% forest. So this land wants to grow trees. It'll turn to trees if you let it, but it doesn't come back as this vibrant forest ecosystem. There's that takes a lot of time, and potentially with all the pressure of invasive plants, a lot of management. So that brings us basically up to today, where these plants, invasive plants, are a serious problem. And there's lots of different ways to think about that. And lots of people want to, dump billions of gallons of herbicide all over everything to deal with that. And I'm not against, I don't want to put a blanket, I would never ever use herbicide statement out there. It's a tool that can potentially be used. But I think these plants are always probably going to be here. I don't know of any project to remove invasive plants that has completely eliminated them from an ecosystem. They just are too good at taking hold and too good at reproducing. So what I think the long-term situation is for people to become more integrated into the habitats that they live in and take firsthand responsibility for managing these plants. Almost all these plants are likely to show up in your landscape given enough time. And if you know what to look for and how to remove them, it can be a fairly minor problem. Once it turns to this, I don't know if people back can see it, but it's a stand of trees completely engulfed in bittersweet. That's when it's kind of like, all right, this is already a big problem. But if you can pull out the bittersweet when it's this big, it's the work of a moment. Yes.
I see where those roads. Can you just quickly tell us?
Yeah, sure. And so the species that are highlighted in this pamphlet from the state are burning bush, glossy buckthorn, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, black swallowwort, autumn olive, Japanese knotweed, rugosa rose, yellow iris, and fountain buckthorn. Thank you. And Merrow's honeysuckle. And all of these plants are just a huge pain in the butt to deal with, some worse than others. But that's a big part of why we can't just kind of set aside wildlands and be like, okay, they'll be fine. They're good habitat now, because these plants will very likely show up. Almost all of them are vectored by birds. So if birds can access the space, then these plants will probably show up and probably cause a problem. And a big part of why these plants are so prone to taking over is they don't have native, or they don't have insect pests, essentially. Like most of the insects that are around here don't particularly want to eat these plants, so they don't have that pressure. Also, almost all of the plants that are native to the Americas are well adapted to fire, and we don't have regular fire on the landscape, and they're well adapted to very low nitrogen soils. And our rain has nitrogen in it now, a lot more than it used to be. And that's because of all the chemical nitrogen that's dumped on Midwestern agriculture. A lot of that stuff off gases in the jet stream brings it to us. So we basically have fertilizer in the rain. And these plants, when they get a little shot of fertilizer, they grow awesome. They grow so fast. And the native plants are like, yeah, whatever. It's like, I could use that or not. So, lots and lots of things are kind of conspiring to make these plants grow great. And all the other plants are like, kind of struggling with this situation. So we can intervene a little bit and say like, all right, we want we want less of these plants and would love to have some more of these plants. All right, next section, the importance of native plants. So this is a little diagram of terrestrial ecosystems. And here we have plants. Everything basically can live because of plants. Plants are so good at taking light from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, water, and some minerals from the soil, and turning it into sugar, and then everything else eats that. And basically, if you don't have plants, you don't have anything else. And that gets a little bit more complicated, where a lot of these herbivores are insects. And insects are often quite host specific. They only have pretty particular plants that they eat. And the most common example of this is the monarch butterfly. Only eats milkweed, right? So if you don't have milkweed, you don't have monarch butterflies. And more generally speaking, if you don't have native plants, you don't have caterpillars. And without caterpillars, you don't have birds or anything that eats birds. And you don't have anything else that kind of eats insects. So it's really important to have native plants around. When it comes to pollinators, we have kind of two categories that we like to put pollinators into. We have generalists and specialists. And generalists will often eat whatever pollen and nectar is around. So lots of non-native plants serve generalist pollinators pretty good. But then we have these specialists that maybe only feed on certain plant families or even particular species. And then caterpillars tend to be even more picky about what they eat. And just as an example of that, we've got two closely related species, the native red maple and invasive Norway maple. And total caterpillar abundance, it's like 2 to 3 times on the red maple versus the Norway maple. And total caterpillar species richness is not quite a stark difference, but the red maple hosts many more. Also, in this particular case, red maples are gorgeous trees with beautiful flowers in the spring, beautiful fall color, and Norway maples are kind of annoying if you're a landscaper or a gardener, because they drop seeds everywhere and you just get a carpet of Norway maple, and they tend to drop limbs too if they're near buildings. It can be a problem. Anyway, native plants kind of are the basis of all terrestrial ecology. So we want to incorporate as many of them into our landscapes as possible. And here's a chickadee eating caterpillar as an example of, if you don't have caterpillars, you're not going to have birds. And you might think of a chickadee, say, as eating a lot of seeds, and that's absolutely true for an adult. But those little baby birds really need a high protein diet. So that's where tons and tons of caterpillars come in. An adult bird can eat many different things depending on the species, but babies usually need a high protein diet to, grow. So incorporating native plants into your landscape is kind of bottom line. That's one of the most important things you can do for a habitat garden. But not all native plants are the same. In fact, ones that are all the same are a big problem. And so when you're thinking about what native plants to plant, it's really great if you can get seed propagated straight species plants. And those are words that someone at a nursery will hopefully understand. And what that means is the plant that you're getting was grown from a seed and not heavily selected. So if you're familiar with Echinacea purpurea, for instance, the purple coneflower, the normal expression of that plant is purple petals with a sort of brown center and one ring of petals. But you can get Echinacea purpurea in any color imaginable with 2 or 3 sets of petals. And those plants, while they are the same species, are so kind of messed up that they often don't produce nectar or don't produce pollen, and they're all clones. So not only do you have a plant that does not provide the ecosystem services that we're hoping to provide with native plants, but it's also, you've narrowed the gene pool of what could potentially be millions and millions of individuals across the landscape to just one. Question? Oh, question over here. Seed propagated straight species. So you want just the normal one. And the idea behind seed propagation being desirable is that way you're getting, if you plant 3 of something, you've got 3 genetic individuals rather than 3 exact clones. So you're supporting that plant's population and that plant having a diverse gene pool. Now, if you want to go for the absolute best habitat plants and, kind of get a gold star, the very best I think that you can find is local ecotype plants. And the idea of local ecotypes is here illustrated with a plant that I love called blue vervain. And this map represents the native range of blue vervain. It grows in every state in the lower 48. And considering how different it is here in Maine from down here in Nevada, do you think those plants might be somewhat different? Yeah, especially given 10,000 plus years of evolution. So the populations that have been here in Maine for 10,000 years are likely to be somewhat different from the ones that are down here in Nevada for 10,000 years. The native plant industry on a national level is kind of centered in the Midwest, where prairie restoration became a big thing in the 80s. So if you get sort of whatever's most abundant in the marketplace, you're most likely to wind up with Midwest ecotype plants. If you buy from a small specialist nursery like myself or others that are listed in the handout, hopefully you can find local ecotype plants. So plants that have been here for a long time, they're going to be hopefully better adapted to our climate, more in sync with our local animal populations, and you're conserving what is likely to be a very endangered genetic resource by growing the local population. Here is a EPA ecoregion map. So we're right here. We're actually kind of on the border of two different ones. I don't remember what they are, and this is not a high quality enough image to see the numbers. But basically, this shows that this right here, that's all one ecoregion, and this is another one. So basically, if the plant population that you're planting originated in this general area, you're doing great. If it came from over here, still the same species, it's still, you know, probably a great thing to plant, but if you could get something that, you know, is maybe better adapted to this region, that would be awesome. One more example about this. This is a caterpillar of the spicebush swallowtail butterfly. And this is a very host-specific butterfly, only feeds on spicebush and sassafras. And both of those plants, their native populations come to their northeast limit in York County. This is a screenshot from a citizen science app called iNaturalist that I'll talk more about in a minute. And this pin right here, that's my house, where I planted spicebush about 10 years ago. And last year I was so thrilled to find this really cool looking caterpillar on it. And these butterflies do get around quite a bit. These pins represent adults. So these are butterflies that flew from this area, you know, looking for new habitat and got quite a ways. But as far as the data available on iNaturalist, my house is the north and east most occurrence of this caterpillar. These are all caterpillar sightings on spicebush. As the climate warms, we're going to start seeing a lot of species losing habitat in the south, and that habitat will shift north and east. I was really into birds when I was a small child, and cardinals were quite rare when I was a kid, and now they're everywhere. Talking to people who've been paying attention to birds longer than I've been alive, cardinals basically did not exist in Maine 50 or 60 years ago, and now they're everywhere. And that's because birds can move to follow their habitat real easy, so easy. But plants have a much harder time moving. So in addition to planting local ecotype native plants, we should probably also be at least considering native plants that, you know, their range ends just short of here, especially ones that are just from the south, so that as those habitats shift with climate change, you know, there's some foothold for those plants and the insects that they support, you know, as all of that stuff moves north and east. And that's just a fun example of that. All right, so before you consider planting anything new, it would be great to figure out what's already growing. And you don't want to kind of remove a bunch of stuff from your landscape and accidentally remove something really cool, because, you know, even in any untended space, there are going to be very desirable native plants present already that if you didn't watch them for a full season or didn't know what you were looking at, you might eliminate without even thinking of it. So, you know, identifying every single plant growing in your yard would be awesome, but don't sweat it if you can't do that. I can't do that. Especially grasses are very tricky, but kind of getting a general idea of what's growing there would be helpful. Wildflowers of New England is a great local wildflower field guide that can be very helpful if you like paper books. If you want a website, we are blessed to have Go Botany, which is a New England focused plant website. It has dichotomous keys, which are the like the impressive way to identify plants rather than just trying to match pictures. But they've also got really great detailed photos and detailed information to help you kind of confirm your identifications. And if you've got a smartphone, iNaturalist is a great app that will allow you to take a picture of a organism. It works on most organisms, and it'll use an algorithm to give you a recommendation of what it might be. You can almost never get a solid species identification, but it will often tell you the genus properly, and then it's pretty easy to narrow it down from there if you even need to. So a combination of iNaturalist and GoBotany is probably your best bet. But if you prefer paper books, that one's quite good. Once you've figured out kind of what's generally going on in the space that you're looking to manage, you'll probably want to remove some plants, probably starting with invasive plants. Not only do these plants have a negative impact on the habitat quality in general, but they're almost all really difficult to manage. So if you get rid of, you spend an hour removing a burning bush, you've saved yourself several hours of work every year removing burning bush seedlings. So it's very much time well spent. And lawns, let's see if I got ahead of myself. One of the first things to consider are trees, because native trees are such an integral part of our ecosystem. So if you have several native trees in your space already, you might be all set. Most of these trees take up a significant amount of space, but not all of them. And like I said, Maine is covered in trees, mostly natives. But in some suburban landscapes, you don't see many native trees. And removing non-native trees and replacing them with native trees, or planting trees if there aren't any around, can have a huge impact. For instance, oaks host over 400 species of insect. That's not something you're going to find with almost any other plant. And yeah, a good thing to aim for is 75% native plants in a landscape. And that 75% is calculated by leaf surface. So if you think of the amount of leaf surface on a big old oak tree, that tree makes a huge difference in getting that 75%. And if you've got, a few large native trees, then you're kind of covered as far as food for caterpillars. These are some of my favorites. Birches, hickories also get, honorable mention. And most of these trees not only provide excellent habitat, but provide something cool for humans too. So oaks, you may not be familiar, but all acorns are human edible. All the ones that grow around here require some degree of processing to remove tannins, but it's fairly accessible to do that. And then you are left with this very nutrient-rich, nutty flour that you can bake into whatever you might like to bake. Maples obviously are the source of maple syrup that everyone loves. Willows provide salicylic acid, which is essentially like aspirin. So it's a common medicinal plant, and also materials for many different crafts. And then wild plums and cherries produce human edible fruit. Most of it's best as jams or jellies, but a lot of it's pretty good out of hand too. And then obviously all these are excellent habitat species. Sunny spaces are probably a great place to focus with planting native plants for habitat. And a lot of that has to do with the sunny spaces being largely absent from our landscape or taken up with non-native plants. So under indigenous management, the understory was regularly burned. Tree spacing was really wide. There's some firsthand accounts that describe, hundreds or thousands of acres of wood lilies, which are now pretty rare. So a lot of plants that, thrive in mostly sunny environments are now just getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. They're not common in suburban landscapes, and in areas that are sunny, like power line cuts, they tend to get choked out by all the invasive species. And then sort of the broad acre field landscapes, which are mostly disappearing, are either cultivated for agriculture, not with native plants, or have had the native plants removed and replaced with European plants like turf grasses or invasive plants from around the world. And you can get a lot of diversity into a small patch of sunny space. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that broad field? We had a couple weeks ago back, and so we just cut it down at the end of the season. I tried to wait till like November, so.
Yep, excellent.
But we have a lot of like straw, the invasive that come in. I really struggle with how to deal with that, or if there's something that I should be putting in, like a couple of trees here and there, like concrete suggestions for that kind of thing, other than just pulling it down in the season.
Yeah, I will get to that when I talk about meadows, for sure. Native shrubs are also a really nice thing to add. They add lots of different types of habitat, nesting habitat for birds, overwintering habitat for insects, et cetera, and a lot of them, like these, also provide food for humans. You're probably familiar with blueberries. There's several different native viburnums. This one, which gets the somewhat sketchy common name highbush cranberry, is totally acrid and terrible until you cook it, and then it's quite delicious. Shadbush, which has a million common names, and the botanical name Amelanchier, is a beautiful landscape tree or shrub. Beautiful white flowers in the spring, followed by blueberry-like fruit and really nice fall color. Elderberries, we have 2 native species, great for birds, and the fruit is great for jams, jellies, and syrups, etc. And then we've got lawns, and just like the name of this series, Lawns Gone Wild, lawns get a lot of flack for being sort of an ecological disaster. And they kind of are, especially a quote unquote well-maintained lawn, where it's often fertilized, herbicides are often used, it's mowed all the time, and it's almost always just Eurasian turf grass. There's kind of nothing there as far as habitat goes. So if you're not gaining any utility out of your lawn, converting it to something else like a meadow or landscaped beds, what have you, is probably a great idea. That said, lawns actually do serve many human purposes, outdoor recreation being a huge one. And there really aren't native plants here in Maine that can totally replace that functionality. So rather than eliminating lawns, if you do have a use for your lawn, if that's a space that you commonly use, rather than eliminating it, a possibility is to diversify. And a lot of these plants will show up in your lawn anyway, and you can just kind of encourage them or let them take over a little bit. And all of these will live in association with turf grasses. Usually, sometimes the grass will crowd them out a little bit. And all of them can be successfully added to lawns. Probably the best way to add them is to either smother a strip in the lawn or a little bit around the edge introduce these plants and then allow them to creep into the other areas. These are all native to Maine, and many of them are excellent pollinator plants or have other human uses. For instance, self-heal, Prunella vulgaris is edible, as with violets and strawberries. Yarrow is medicinal. Plantain is medicinal and edible. And they're all quite beautiful in my opinion. Also, I only learned a couple years ago about this plant, American plantain or Plantago regelii. It looks almost the same as Plantago major, which is a common European, I wouldn't say invasive because they don't do enough damage to ecosystems. They kind of just blend in. But if you see what appears to be the common broadleaf plantain, but it's got red stem bases, that is the American species Plantago regelii. Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different styles of native plant landscaping. I'm going to come back to this slide as an example of like traditional bed-based landscapes. And a native plant landscape can kind of look like whatever you want it to look like. So it doesn't have to look, you know, wild or untended. It can look, you know, it can have the aesthetic features that you want from landscaping, just with utilizing appropriate native plants. That said, a lot of our landscape practices that we have become accustomed to are kind of inherently bad for habitat. And if you can accept some aesthetic changes to your landscape, you'll not only save yourself a bunch of work, but dramatically increase the quality of the habitat. And I'll talk more about that in a minute when we talk about management. So this is a catch basin, I think in Portland, that utilizes a lot of native plants and creates habitat around a piece of what is essentially city infrastructure. The hell strip between the sidewalk and the road is a common, you know, patch of greenery in areas that don't have much and can be a great place for a small native plant installation. And then we've got meadows, and meadows are full sun to part sun areas with basically complete coverage of grasses and other herbaceous plants. And if you're not familiar with the word herbaceous, it means that they die back to the ground every year. So they don't have woody above ground structures. Meadows are really interesting and can be quite diverse, create a lot of pollinator habitat, and they can also be potentially easier to establish than many other native plant landscapes because they can be direct seeded. So rather than buying individual plants that you plant in the ground, you buy seed that you spread on the surface, typically in the fall, and it just kind of grows up from scratch, if you will. And the most important part of trying to direct seed is getting the right mix of seeds and doing a lot of preparation. If the ground is not properly prepared, you'll tend to get, you know, just too many invasive plants that will compete with your meadow planting. And I'll talk more about these installation methods in another section. But meadows can be really nice and relatively easy to manage.
Question one, the times the seeds they sell are annual. She don't want perennial in there, correct?
Correct, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, having a mix that has some annuals to get the system going and cover the ground quickly but then has many diverse species of perennials that will be able to get established and hold that space long term is very important. All right, on to management. Oh, question back in the back.
On meadows, I mow my meadow once a year.
Yep.
In recent years, I've had birds. That's on there that I should.
It's probably some degree of succession, just which I'll talk about in a minute, of the habitat changing over time. Probably not a problem. If you've got like sensitive fern that's completely taking over, that could be a problem, but some degree of ferns creeping in, those are all going to be native species. They're all going to be providing habitat. Might not be an issue. Yeah. So if they're taking over and reducing biodiversity significantly, you might try smothering a patch of them and specifically introducing plants that might be very well suited. So ferns often like damp soil. So potentially, trying to smother out a patch of ferns and introduce something like Joe Pyeweed that would be able to overtop the ferns, compete with them, and would enjoy that damp soil might be a good option. So the first management, well, backing up a tiny bit, management for habitat is a topic that could cover lifetimes of study. It can be extremely complicated if you want to get into the difficult details of it. But at the same time, it can be really simple, and the simple version basically amounts to don't screw up natural processes. And the first thing you can do to not screw up natural processes is try to avoid dumping poison on them. So minimizing or eliminating the use of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides is obviously going to have a dramatic positive effect if those things were in regular rotation. So great to avoid those. Sometimes it's your only option, and I don't want to eliminate it as a option of last resort. The next thing is don't be in a hurry to clean up. A messy garden is better habitat than a pristine garden. And this is one of those aesthetic choices that if you want good habitat, you kind of have to let go of fall cleanup. Just let it be a mess. And the reason for that is there's a lot of habitat potential in those dead stems and fallen leaves. So here we see a bird feeding on some, looks like echinacea seed heads. By leaving material like this up, it gives fall food for migratory birds and winter food for overwintering birds in the seed head. A lot of these stems are also hollow or just have a pithy inside, and that's overwintering habitat for many species of insects. Lots of insects overwinter in fallen tree leaves. So the less raking up of tree leaves that you can do, the better. If you have like paths and stuff that get covered in leaves, or a deck, something like that, yeah, definitely rake those off. But hopefully, you can move those leaves like this far into a landscape bed or into the edge of the woods or whatever, and let them decompose there. After the overwintering period, once temperatures reach kind of consistently 50 degrees, then a lot of whatever is overwintering in that habitat has woken up and moved on, and you can cut down these dead stems. Wherever possible, I tend to just let them do their natural thing and fall over and decompose. If I'm going to cut down dead stems, I tend to just what they call chop and drop, cut them, throw them on the ground. Now they're mulch and they decompose in place. Some exceptions to that are pruning trees, especially cultivated trees and fruit trees. That is, I think, a generally a good practice for cultivated trees. So that's fine to do. Also, if you have disease or pest issues in cultivated plants, certainly remove that material. Well, of course, keeping in mind, like, what is a pest issue? You want caterpillars, you want insects eating your plants because that's an important part of their function as habitat. So I wouldn't consider those to be a pest issue. However, if you've got like cabbage loopers on your broccoli, that's a pest issue. Yes.
What you say about or the Facebook page where people are always fighting back and forth on like, leave the ticks are gonna come. Clear them up, you're like, do you disservice to the rest of nature? Like, any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a thorny question because it's true. Like, habitat for ticks is a real concern. So trying to, you know, like I was saying about like lawns are bad habitat wise, but you want a place to play outside. So maybe you have a, you know, maybe you maintain a lawn. If your lawn is a play space or a space that you're typically walking through, then maybe you remove the leaves from there to reduce tick habitat. Where possible, if you can clear paths, it's perfectly fine to remove the leaves from the path. And if you stay walking on the path, then you're not hopefully interacting with ticks too much. But yeah, that's a thorny issue, and there isn't a simple answer, unfortunately. Yes.
Following up on the tick discussion. Back when I was much younger, we would run through fields and stuff. And
Yeah.
Never worked very much, but we burned our fields. We're not burning our fields now.
Yes.
My question is why?
Why have we stopped burning? Great question. I don't know, because it's a very effective strategy. So for anyone who couldn't hear this gentleman, he said, when I was a kid, we didn't have tick issues and we burned our fields. And I think there is an association. It's certainly not the whole picture, but landscape level prescribed fire is an important tool that is seriously underutilized. And it was a very formative tool of indigenous management. And it's something that it's probably worth bringing back. Not only would it significantly affect our tick populations, but a lot of our invasive plant issues would also be helped by that. Because like I said, the native ecology of this place evolved under fire regimes by indigenous people. So almost all of our native plants are highly adapted to fire. They do great with fire. Many of the invasive plants don't like fire. So we can kind of give an edge to our native plants and native ecosystem by bringing fire back into our management practices. That said, we also have tons of houses that are made of wood, and not a lot of people who are skilled at using fire as a tool in that way. So it's not like, go get a drip torch and start burning everything down. It's much more complicated than that. So there are trainings available on how to use fire at a landscape scale. And there are several properties owned by the Nature Conservancy that are specifically managed with fire because that is what is required of that ecosystem. So bringing back fire is, not out of the question, and I think something that as a society, we should be considering more. All right, another management aspect is leaving dead trees. Dead trees are excellent habitat for many things. And if you're managing woodlands, you can simply leave some dead material. You can leave all of it, but leaving a decent amount helps a lot. In this picture, you can see woodpecker holes, which are great nesting sites for birds. What's harder to see in the picture is there's also a ton of beetle holes. And those beetle holes are nesting habitat for many, many species of insect. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Deer are a significant management hurdle. Obviously, deer need to eat too, and they are part of this ecosystem. But we have unfortunately removed their native predators. And that has a really significant effect on the population of deer and their behavior. So not only do we have a lot more deer than there used to be, but they are kind of able to just hang out and eat everything. Whereas when there were, wolves around to eat them, they kind of had to be moving more and more on guard all the time. Hunting obviously has an effect on deer populations. And because of that, I am pro hunting. Like something needs to happen to keep the deer population in check, and bringing wolves back to Cumberland County is probably a hard sell or near impossible. I'd love to see wolves in the North Woods for sure, but it'd be hard to get them into this landscape. And even hunting is difficult in such a suburban landscape. So fencing out deer is like a big intervention that can remove that pressure. That said, most native plants can, coexist with deer just fine. Sometimes it is necessary to fence a planting to help it get going. So for instance, if you have high deer pressure, you might need to fence your little elderberries until they get established. Once they're established, they can take some deer browse, they can grow above the browse line, etc. And you can take away that little mini fence. But short of shooting the deer or putting up a real big fence to keep them out, small targeted fencing is probably your best bet. Also, dogs are.
I have 4.
Yeah.
There's no difference. They all 10, the deer must roam my property. They don't care nothing for dogs, bark, and
Yeah. So it relates a lot to pressure. Other than killing the deer, if your pressure is like low or moderate, lots of interventions like dogs or smelly sprays or stuff can be effective. When the pressure is high, there's almost nothing that you can do short of physically excluding them or killing them. Yeah.
Especially when snow so fast. I'm finding all of those putting around these sprays. So it really is.
Yeah, and that's indicative of high pressure.
Yeah.
Because I would say at my place I experience moderate pressure. So the areas where the dogs are commonly, I get minimal deer damage, and then you go like a little bit further out away from the house, and suddenly they're eating everything, and I need to fence off trees that I'm trying to get going and stuff like that. So yeah, deer, they're an issue. If you have high deer pressure, consider learning to hunt. So I just wanted to mention at least succession. And succession is a natural process where ecosystems change over time. And around here, given a few thousand years, you'll get old growth forest on basically every patch of land. There are exceptions to that, obviously. And so succession tends to move towards more biodiversity in the ecosystem, more biomass in the ecosystem, et cetera, and the oppositional force, the force that moves backwards from that, is disturbance. And disturbance is where we live, disturbance is often human caused, so it can be cutting of trees, development, et cetera, spraying of poisons. These are all disturbances. More like weather focused disturbances can be, a hurricane, a microburst, fire, flooding. All of these things also cause disturbance. And when you are managing a habitat garden, you either want to see succession happen. So for instance, if you plant an oak tree in a field, or a dozen oak trees in a field, you likely want to see those trees turn into big trees, and they're going to shade everything around them, and you're going to get a different pattern and patchwork of plants in the shade of those trees, and that is succession happening. Alternately, you want to create small or moderate disturbances to prevent succession from happening. So if you want to plant and maintain a meadow, some disturbance is necessary to keep that meadow from turning into a forest, because that's what will happen if you don't do anything for about 20 years. And so some common small disturbances: mowing, prescribed fire, weed pulling. These are all great practices to have in your toolbox. And multiple people have mentioned annual mowing. That's a pretty common practice to keep out woody plants from a meadow or field or other space. If the pressure to turn into forest is low, you can maybe even do it every other year. And if you want to learn the required skills, you can burn instead of mow, and that could be on like a 1 to 3, maybe even 4-year rotation, because a fire, basically just interacts differently with the woody plants than a mower does. So some degree of disturbance is the only thing that's going to keep a meadow in existence in this climate. But too much disturbance is also kind of bad for habitat. So if you imagine, a field full of really cool insects and bird habitat, and you burn that twice a year, you're going to burn up all those insects and all their habitat. So, you want to do the minimum amount of disturbance in order to keep succession where you want it. So normally a meadow will get disturbed in some way every 1 to 3 years to kind of keep it there. All right, on to some landscape features that you can consider adding. Across a broader landscape, you'll probably find all of these features, and it's not necessary to have, every habitat niche in every garden. But if you want to support the broadest biodiversity in your habitat garden, having one or more of these features can be very useful. Water of some sort adds a lot to habitat. And a water feature can range from a mud puddle to a pond deep enough not to freeze solid. And kind of the steps along there is mud puddle. Like if you've got any spot that stays permanently wet, that's your mud puddle. And that provides habitat for insects to get water. And also a lot of insects use mud as a building material, and giving them a place to collect little bits of mud is actually quite useful. The next step up is sort of like 1 foot deep pond that never goes dry, which might mean like, oh, there's a drought, I got to use my garden hose to like fill up my 1 foot deep pond. It can be quite stagnant, but that's not necessarily desirable. So having a little pond pump that rotates the water can help prevent it from going stagnant. And in just a foot deep of water, you provide reproductive habitat for amphibians, which is really important, as well as reproductive habitat for many species of insects like dragonflies. Unfortunately, you also provide habitat for mosquitoes. But in the scheme of things, like this much mosquito habitat isn't going to make not that much difference. And if you and mosquitoes will breed in any tiny amount of water quite quickly. But if you provide a foot deep thing that never goes dry, you'll also get dragonflies, which puts downward pressure on mosquito populations. If you want to go bigger than that, or if you have an old farm pond that can be renovated or what have you, if you go deeper than 4 feet, you'll get a pond that will not freeze solid, and that can be habitat for fish, turtles, etc. That's a bigger consideration, but something small like this is pretty easy to do. Not a great picture, but having a little patch of bare ground somewhere is an important habitat feature. Like most of the time on the broad scale, I'm encouraging people to not have open soil. You want that covered with plants, or if it's not covered with plants, you want to cover it with mulch. But there are actually a lot of ground nesting insects. And having a little patch of bare ground is very helpful to them. And if your soil is heavy, or it's compacted, or it's clay, digging out even just a few square feet and replacing that with a mix of sand and loam provides another type of nesting habitat. And in my garden, I have a small patch of cactus garden where I grow cacti and hardy succulents. And in that area, I have a sand mulch. So the area that's not covered with plants is just sand. And I see so many interesting wasps and ground nesting bees nesting in there. And if you're at all freaked out by the idea of ground nesting wasps and bees, almost all of them, let's say 95%, are solitary and do not sting humans. Social wasps sting because they're protecting their colony almost exclusively, unless you step on them. And these solitary wasps and bees basically don't have an incentive to sting you. Question?
Succulents, yes, but you have cacti that's spotted.
Yes. I have several species. There is only one that is near native, Opuntia humifera. And oddly enough, Maine is one of 2 states without a native cactus. Anyone care to guess what the other one is? Everyone always says Alaska. It's Hawaii. And cacti can actually be extremely cold tolerant. Case in point, they grow in Alaska. But usually in very dry microclimates. And Opuntia humifera, I would consider to be essentially a native plant here, and is native as close as the seacoast of New Hampshire. So yeah, it's a neat plant. If you don't have standing dead wood around in a woodland or something like that, you can have a pile of rotting logs. You too can have a pile of rotting logs. Ideally, you want round wood with the bark on it, which you can find on the roadside frequently. It can be in a pile like this, or you could, take a chunk and kind of partially bury it so it stands upright. Whatever you want, but that's great habitat. Beetles will get in there, make holes in it, and when they're done using it, solitary wasps and bees will use those holes. Eventually fungi will come in and rot that. It'll turn into beautiful soil. It's just a nice habitat feature that would obviously naturally occur. And sometimes if it's not naturally occurring, you can make it happen. Alternately, a lot of the same habitat can be created like this. So this is just a scrap of untreated lumber with some holes drilled in it. There is a handout on the Xerxes Society website that talks about how to make both these things. These are bundles of sections of Japanese knotweed stem. All of these things provide nesting habitat for solitary wasps and bees, and they should be closed at one end and open at one end. So these bundles, they all have a node at the other end that closes them off and are open at this end. Ideally, you want sort of a variety of hole sizes to play host to a variety of different insects. And these are, the utility of these is, who knows? I think just having some wood out in the landscape is perfectly adequate. What I do like about these type of habitat interventions is you can stick this like right outside your door or by the chair that you sit in your garden or whatever. And it's a great place to actually be able to observe these insects. And you'll see different tiny little species of insects using these, and you'll see these tunnels fill up as they lay eggs and feed babies in there. And you'll see them capped with various materials. So you'll see, this species collects mud from the mud puddle and makes a little mud nest. And this species collects little tiny pieces of grass and like packs the hole with grass. So they're very interesting and interactive, and do provide habitat, not strictly necessary if you've got a pile of rotting logs. Bird houses are another nice habitat intervention. Naturally, you would have dead trees around with woodpeckers making holes, and then that's nesting habitat for many species of bird. If you don't have that, you can make a bird box. And this is a eastern bluebird. We put up a few bluebird boxes in our yard and have had nesting pairs of bluebirds every year since the second year. It took a couple years for them to get going. And they're absolutely a delight to watch. And you can see this is a male bluebird who's got a caterpillar in his bill. And once those babies hatch, the parents are in and out of there every 5 to 10 minutes, just like constantly bringing caterpillars in, which if you have a vegetable garden or an orchard or fruiting shrubs or whatever, that's really nice because that's tamping down the pest pressure. And just the more interactions you can get into a habitat, the better the habitat tends to function. And that includes like human habitat. All right, so a little bit about how to establish these gardens. I myself am a big advocate of a technique called sheet mulching. And I've got a series of slides to kind of walk you through that process. Who here is familiar with sheet mulching? Not bad, that's about half. When I started actively promoting sheet mulching 10 plus years ago, there was usually like 1 or 2 people. And I think it's really catching on and it's extremely useful. And it has lots of great benefits, like preserving soil quality, minimizing damage to soil biology, all this stuff. Also, it's really easy and doesn't hurt your back, which I have come to appreciate more and more. These pictures are from a project that I've volunteered at for many years called Mount Joy Orchard. It's a free to pick public orchard off of Washington Ave in Portland. You should definitely check it out if you're ever in the area. And in this sheet mulch, we utilized fall tree leaves that you can see here and compost, and you can kind of see the pattern of the beds, and then these grassy strips between our areas where we're going to have paths. For a habitat garden, I wouldn't necessarily add compost. And that might seem a little counterintuitive, but as I mentioned before, most of our native plants are well adapted to like weak soil or soil without a lot of nitrogen in it. And adding compost will make the soil much richer. That can be very useful for certain native plants, but generally speaking, the native plants will do just fine without that addition, and it will tamp down on weed pressure essentially by not making the soil too rich. If your soil is essentially dead or not really soil, it's just like bare sand, then you either want plants that are highly adapted to that environment, or maybe you want to add a little compost or some tree leaves or what have you to kind of get the process going. So compost as needed. The first step of sheet mulching is usually to cut the grass as short as you can get it, cut down any other unwanted plant material in the area. And then you spread whatever bottom layers you want. Could be compost, could be tree leaves. This is a great use for partially decomposed compost or compost that's full of weed seeds. That if you put that on the surface, you might get a whole bunch of weeds and it's a big mess. But if you use that underneath a layer of cardboard or newspaper, the seeds will germinate, come up, hit that sheet layer, and never be able to really make it. The next step is to cover with overlapping layers of cardboard or several layers of newspaper. If you're using cardboard, you want to remove any plastic tape and any plastic reinforcement, lest you put a bunch of plastic in your soil. That's not nice. A lot of people will remove shiny ads and inserts from newspaper. And if you're using newspaper, you ideally want at least 7 layers thick. And I will throw all that stuff in a wheelbarrow and soak it first, so it gets kind of matted and it keeps it from blowing away while you're working. And then you need some sort of top layer. Here we're using wood chips. Wood chips are great. Tree leaves are also great. And tree leaves are, for a period of time in every year, widely available. You can also make a pretty darn good sheet mulch by collecting bagged leaves, rip the bag open, use the bag as your sheet layer, and then just the leaves that were in the bag on top of it. If you have really light, fluffy tree leaves, they do tend to blow away, and you can eliminate that problem by putting something on top of them. Tree branches, wood chips, or seaweed from the beach are all great options. And once you've got all your sheet layer covered up, you can either plant directly into it by cutting holes in the sheet layer and planting directly. That works quite well for anything that's grown in a pot. It's pretty hard to direct sow into a sheet mulch, but it can be done. The other option is to just let the sheet mulch sit for a season and then plant into it the year after. By the 1-year mark, the sheet layer is usually completely biodegraded. So here are some beds at Mount Joy that were established with sheet mulch. These get maintained once a month. So that's kind of the result of sheet mulching, is you get a little bit of a grace period, usually about a year, where there's not a lot of weed pressure. So if you can sheet mulch a spot, get rid of the existing vegetation, plant heavily enough so that it fills in pretty well by the end of 1 year, then you should have a planting that is somewhat resistant to weed pressure. There's no such thing as a no maintenance landscape, but this is a technique that I think is conducive to low maintenance. Here's another option. Question? Yes. Yeah. If you want to direct sow, this is probably a better bet. It's a process called occlusion. Here we're using a silage tarp. Other tarp material can work. Ideally, you want something that doesn't let light through. And woven tarps are iffy at best. They tend to degrade pretty rapidly and turn into a million tiny pieces of plastic that are really annoying to clean up. So silage tarps don't do that. They are, I'd say, sensitive to having holes poked in them. So they don't work great if there's a lot of woody material. But if you have mostly non-woody material in the spring, you can mow, roll out a silage tarp, weight it down. And here you can see a wheelbarrow full of riprap stone. So that's 6-inch crushed stone. And I prefer that to sandbags because the sandbags are typically made of woven material that degrades in the sun and turns into a little million pieces of plastic and very annoying. Stones are not going to do that and are basically infinitely reusable for this project. So once you've got your tarp, as close to the ground as you can get it, weighted down so it doesn't blow away, you leave it there for a full season or even a full year. But I think usually placing it in the spring and then sowing your seeds in the fall is a good plan. The reason you want to, generally speaking, plant in the fall is a lot of native plants require a process called stratification, which means they won't sprout until they've experienced a period of cold, damp weather. So if you plant them in the fall, you're going to hopefully get good germination popping up in the spring. Yeah, so those are a couple different ways to establish new habitat gardens. There are some situations where sheet mulching is kind of ill-advised. Steep slopes, it's just really hard to keep that material in place long enough. Really, really tough invasive plants are sometimes difficult or impossible to sheet mulch out. Specifically Japanese knotweed. It's possible, but it's very difficult. And quackgrass has a razor sharp terminal bud on the end of the rhizome that just pokes right through the cardboard. So it's not, it can be useful, but it's going to require a lot of hand weeding to sheet mulch out a big patch of quackgrass. All right, additional resources. We have the luxury of here in Maine having the Wild Seed Project. This was started by a woman named Heather McCargo, who used to work for New England Wildflower Society, now Native Plant Trust. And it's just a really great project, tons and tons of information on their website, lots of local events happening. And also they sell packets of native plant seed that are often otherwise pretty hard to come by. So we have this organization doing all this great research and outreach for us, and it's all kind of micro-targeted towards our climate. A couple of great books, which I think you can get. Yep.
Just a question, Wild Seed Project, site to go and purchase online?
I think you can only purchase stuff through their website. Their office is in North Yarmouth, but I think it's just an office. They don't have any like retail. Yeah. Also, Wild Seed Project, you can join the organization and get their annual publications, which are quite nice. They have a magazine that they put out sometimes. Recently, they've been putting out small books. So they have one on native trees for landscaping, native ground covers. Great information. Some books that I believe are both available, if not from this library, certainly through Maine Cat, which is like the state level interlibrary loan network. The Xerxes Society focuses on insect conservation, a lot of great information on their website. Some of it is linked in the handout. Maine Audubon has a variety of habitat gardening information, ranging from native plants to woodland management, lots of other great information. And feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on the handout if you have particular questions. If there's snow on the ground, I'll probably get back to you relatively quickly. If there's not, it might be a while or I might never get back to you. Just put it out there. And so that's kind of what I have for you for general information. I think that's kind of most of our time limit. I do have a few additional slides or time to take questions. Would people like a couple of plant suggestions? And I'll take your questions.
Said that some of the grass, as Paul said, if you have a meadow, what's the best time to mow it? Forestation.
Great question. As late as possible, like right before it snows, basically. And the reason for that is, no matter when in the season you do the mowing, you're gonna get those woody plants that you want to remove. But ideally, you want to give a lot of the asters, like New England aster and calico aster, a chance to set seed and reproduce. And that often doesn't happen until the first week in November. So like second, third week in November is prime time for mowing. If we get an early snow and you don't get to it, not a problem, just do it in the spring. Basically whenever you can in the spring, especially if you can get it when the snow has melted but the ground is still frozen, because spring mowing, the potential problem is mud. Like you don't want to make a big ruddy mess. But yeah, so end of the year is ideal, and if you miss it, then you can always try and find a time in spring to do it.
It was a 4-acre meadow right up against a whole bunch of woodland.
Yep.
And we don't want to set food for fire.
Yeah, naturally occurring fires in Maine are super rare. Our climate is just so damp. It's hopefully not much of an issue, but yes, it should be fine. As far as once a year or once every other year mowing late fall, that should do the trick. Question here.
You cut out or dig pine bush, it's up on that sort of thing. What do you recommend? Because bringing it to our brush dump, they shred it and then you end up just spreading all the seeds again. You should come and take the compost.
Yeah, so if you're cutting it at a time of year when it has fruit on it, you could burn it, just pile it up and burn it. That's one option. Ideally, if you could cut it when it doesn't have fruit on it, that's good. If it's something like bittersweet, for instance, that regenerates rapidly from roots, if you're pulling it out, letting it desiccate in the sun will effectively kill it. Burning it also kills it. And bringing it to the town brush dump is probably fine. It's probably going to sit long enough that it is unlikely to regenerate except from seed.
Could we recommend town should burn? And should we have 2 separate piles then for invasive stuff and other stuff and have the town burn?
I would be leery to like just burn that much material just to get rid of it without some sort of data. Like if someone studied it a little bit and was like, oh, we're actually causing a problem by spreading these invasive species, like if that was confirmed to be a problem, then you'd have to figure out some sort of management. But I don't know that it usually is. I've taken a lot of sketchy wood chips from various sources and generally don't have issues. But that's a tricky one that I don't have enough data to have a recommendation. Question in the back?
I think the question, so like a small, like a tiny size of that, if I read it till everything's 50 degrees, then it's like just shot with a heat pepper or
Yep.
pretty sure. That's like-
Whatever you got. Yep.
And then, in terms of the invasive and getting rid of that, battle, or like if you're keeping it down, I would hesitate to think that like community brush fire. I think that would be
Yeah, probably. Depending on what state it's in. Like
right.
if
Make sure you're dehydrated.
yeah, if you like set it out on a paved driveway until it's like totally dry, then it's dead.
On this for this on the end process, and then you took a line killer on it.
Yep.
That just as okay as you didn't use it there.
Yeah. So that is a prime example of why I don't want to put a blanket ban on herbicide. Like that I think is a very judicious use of herbicide. You're not spraying it. It's not going everywhere. You're using just a little bit and it's going to like really have a dramatic effect. Yeah.
I read on the that's all they read. And I can't remember what the size.
I think I read about this.
It was like
I think it's 1/2 inch.
higher than allow it to grow up and girls. So they girls still now.
Yeah.
It's a time for them.
Yeah, interesting. I want to experiment with that myself just to see if it works. So yeah, interesting stuff. Question by the door.
No mowing, right? Like not mowing. So.
Yeah, so if you think back to the slide about diversifying lawn, a lot of those early spring flowers that you might get in a lawn like bluets, stuff like that. If you can hold off on mowing lawns that are going to get mowed on a regular basis through the month of May, or like if you've got a nice patch of violets blooming in June, just mow around it, you know, within reason, like taking into consideration like what you're using the lawn for and tick pressure and all that. Whenever you can, just like mow around the stuff that's in bloom. That's a nice thing to do. All right, I'm just gonna blast through a couple of cool plant recommendations. These are Labrusca grapes. It's a native grape species. If you're familiar with Concord grapes, basically the same thing. They grow real easy and have a lot of habitat benefits. This is our native Clematis, Clematis virginiana. They have clouds of little white flowers in the summer and then these really cool seed heads in the winter. This is Apios americana, the groundnut. Beautiful flowers, beautiful foliage. They do tend to run around a lot. So if you don't want something that's gonna like climb all over everything, don't plant this one. But sunny spots, especially sunny, damp meadow edges, edge of the ditch, something like that, is a great one. One of my favorite native plants, Rudbeckia laciniata. So same genus as like black-eyed Susan, but these are real tall, like 5 to 7 feet tall. And human edible greens that are delicious. Late summer blooms for many different types of insects and fall and winter seed heads for birds. Rudbeckia laciniata, or cutleaf coneflower, also called sochan. All these are in the handout too. This is Golden Alexander's, which is an early season member of the carrot family, or Apiaceae. There's a lot of specialist insects that really like this plant. Makes a nice garden border, good meadow plant. This is clustered mountain mint, Pycnanthemum uticum. There's I think like 5 or 6 species of Pycnanthemum that are native or near native. They're all in the mint family, are extremely attractive to many different pollinators, and several of them have a really nice taste for teas and cooking that I would describe as mintier than mint. So if you like powerful mint flavor, try a mountain mint. This is our native bee balm, also called wild bergamot. It's Monarda fistulosa, very attractive to lots of different insects as well as hummingbirds. And I think this will be the very last slide. This is common milkweed, a much maligned pasture weed until recently, when people started to come around to the idea that we like having monarch butterflies around, and if we want monarch butterflies, got to have milkweed. There are several species of milkweed. I particularly like this one. It's indestructible, and it has many human edible parts. The shoots, the young leaves, the flower buds, the flowers, and the young pods are all edible. They must be cooked, but they don't need to be boiled to death. Just hot all the way through is usually good enough. The first time you eat it, only eat a little bit because it doesn't agree with everyone. But I find common milkweed to be quite delicious and is an amazing habitat plant and extremely easy to grow. Kind of aggressive, so don't put it in with some delicate flowers, but put it on some edge somewhere and let it go wild. I think that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.